An additional opportunity we have here today is to learn a little bit more about a very remote part of Alaska and explained to us by a very passionate investigator who holds a Ph.D. from the University of Alaska Fairbanks, knows this area very well personally, and is personally constructing and approaching a 50-year database on the nature of seabirds, particularly black guillemots, and working on Cooper Island. And the closest I ever got to Cooper Island was an overflight. It was remarkably impressive as I visited Barrow. But one day perhaps I'd be able to get there. I've struck up a brief acquaintance with George on the way in here, but George Divoky is a remarkable man. He had formerly worked for the federal government, 2 agencies, in order to kickstart and sustain his investigation of the wildlife on Cooper Island. He's now established a not-for-profit foundation, a 501c3, that he basically runs with a guiding board, but he's the energy behind it. And he has a remarkable story to tell and a remarkable experience in his life. And I'd like to ask you to please welcome Dr. George Divoky as he explains to us his passion and his achievement working on Cooper Island. Thank you. George.
I'd like to thank the organizers of the Ocean 17 for having me speak here. Specifically, Carol Jansen, thank you. Okay, I'm not getting it on the confidence monitor, but Carol Jensen and Bob Seitz for doing what they could to stay in touch with me this summer while I was out in the field to make sure that I could be here shortly after I left the field, and for making my participation possible. I'd like to thank MTS and the Alaska Ocean Observing System and Molly McCammon. I use their data on a daily basis when I'm not in the field, and I'm glad that they were just certified recently because I didn't want to use data that was not actually certified. Just out of curiosity, is there any way of getting the confidence monitor working or not? Okay, well, let me tell you that we are in Anchorage, Alaska, and I flew up here in September of 1970, and many of you, I know, have come to the state and to Anchorage for the first time. My first flight up here was in September of 1970. I was heading for the North Slope, and due to things I found up there in 1970, 71, 72, I've been going to the North Slope for the past 47 years as a result, and specifically have spent the last 44 years on Cooper Island doing a study that I'm going to be talking to you about today, even though you can see the slides and I can't. So, I went up there in 1970 to do ocean monitoring. I was a seabird biologist at the Smithsonian Institution when the Coast Guard called up and said, we would like someone to go up and do a survey of the Beaufort Sea. The reason they wanted to do that is because oil had been found in Prudhoe Bay in the late 60s, and people wanted to build a pipeline rather quickly. And this was a time in 1970 when Earth Day was happening and you started to have to write EISs and various things like that. So they realized they had to hold off on building the pipeline. And as they were holding off on that, and they wanted to get the oil to market faster than they could possibly with the pipeline, they then thought about taking supertankers through the Northwest Passage. And there was actually one supertanker that went through the Manhattan and did actually get through with a great deal of damage to it. But the Coast Guard was concerned about people not knowing anything about the Beaufort Sea, and they asked me as a seabird biologist, a pre-doctoral fellow in the bird division at the Smithsonian, to go on the cruise. So I did that in 1970. And as part of that, in 71 and 72 censused barrier islands, the Coast Guard, and I would like to thank the Coast Guard for basically getting me started on this study. They would take me into various barrier islands, and I would walk them and see what was on them. And Cooper Island was just one of the islands that I visited. The coast of Alaska, north of Cape Lisburne, has low sand and gravel bars. It doesn't have the rocky cliffs that that most people know from the southern part of Alaska. And I would walk these driftwood lines looking for nests, for seabird nests, and finding things like this Arctic tern nest. I would find Arctic terns, Sabine gulls, glaucous gulls, various things like that. And it was all very interesting. But then I visited Cooper Island, and you have to be very careful who you fall in love with or what you fall in love with in your mid-20s, because I went out there thinking it was just going to be another census. But what I found was the fact that the Navy, and I would also like to thank anyone from the Navy for what they did, because in the 50s, you didn't have to clean up your sites. And they were out there blowing up ordnance and dumping ordnance from the Korean War, from the just finished Korean War. And they left all these boxes and buildings out there. And as they left, they used some of the ordnance to just blow up the buildings. And if they hadn't done that, then I wouldn't have been able to find black guillemots breeding in the cavities that were under some of those boxes. So I turned over one of the boxes and found the first black guillemot colony in the Beaufort Sea that had ever been found. And this was very exciting for a range of reasons. It was a range extension. It was very unique nesting habitat. It's a cavity nesting species typically found in talus, scree, and slopes and things like that. But even more exciting is that in my earlier visits, and again, the Coast Guard pilots took me there 4 or 5 times that summer, which really helped nail things down for me. I had turned over some boxes that didn't have birds breeding in them and went back and found that they did have birds breeding in them. So I had created, I was at the edge of the Arctic Ocean. I was 27 years old, and I had just created nest sites for something. And anyone who's ever put out a bird feeder or certainly a bird house, and you suddenly get really connected to this. And I'm just trying to explain what my current pathology might be in terms of focusing in on the species the way that I have. So I have spent 43 years now out there. The first 28 were in a tent. It's cold up in the Arctic. It is a harsh and fragile ocean that is the Arctic Ocean. I knew it was very harsh. I was to find out just how fragile it was by doing the study as long as I did. And for the past 15 years, I have lived in a 8x12 cabin, which is half the size of this platform that I'm sitting on right now. And that's where I spent this past June, an 8x12 box that looks a lot like this inside. So I walked in here yesterday morning, having seen this for the past 3 months, looked at this room, having talked to 4 people from June 20th until September 7th, talked to them in person and not on the satellite phone. So this is a different experience for me. I'm still going through my re-entry, if you will. I didn't know that Manse black guillemot was Manse black guillemot was a species that I found, or the subspecies I found breeding in those boxes. I didn't know then that it was a rather special type of black guillemot. Guillemots are common in the Pacific. There's a pigeon guillemot there. Black guillemots are found down the coast throughout Maine, and they're a common bird on the British Isles. But what happened with black guillemots, with Manse black guillemots, and we know this from genetic testing, is that they were trapped in the middle of the Arctic Basin during the last glacial maximum. There was an unglaciated part of the Arctic Ocean where seabirds could somehow survive in tiny cracks in the ice. And we know that it got down to very few individuals that could do this. There was a bottleneck 15,000 years ago. But all those birds that were there lost their migratory inclination, because you're not going to migrate over the Bering Land Bridge. You might migrate across it if you're a human, but you're not going to migrate over it if you're a seabird. So they lost all that migratory inclination, and they also became totally adapted to breeding on, or to feeding on the cryopelagic ecosystem, which in the Arctic, because there's no real upwelling, or certainly wind-driven circulation because of the ice cap. There is a rich, though, fauna and flora that is tied to sea ice, where you have phytoplankton in the ice, algae under it, feeding a system where you have Arctic cod, which is a species typically found in waters 2 Celsius and lower. And Guillemots became adapted to feeding on Arctic cod and basically specializing in them and learning how to use cracks in the ice to do that. These are all things I found out in the past few years. I had no idea, of course, when I found those boxes with the eggs in '72. And Arctic cod actually will hide in the crevices in the ice, and you have zooplankton that actually cling to the underside. And it's kind of like an inverted coral reef, or some of the divers who've gone down there say it's like that. So also, one of the things that's important to me is that people who study seabirds lay their eggs and raise their young in places where predators can't get them, and predators would include humans. So humans who want to study them have a great deal of trouble getting to the eggs and the nests. I have friends who go to places like the cliffs that are on the left-hand side there and go over the edge with ropes and weigh chicks and do various things like that. I come from a long line of people that didn't go over the edge of cliffs unless we were forced to. But I certainly give credit for those people who can do that. And I was also raised in a glaciated lake bed in Cleveland, Ohio, so I have a fear of great vertical relief. And then the orca colony on the other side of the slide, on the right-hand side, shows one of the problems people have in the Aleutians. All these birds are breeding very deep in crevices, well under the surface, and also there's so many of them. I don't know how you could focus on any given nest. You'd have to pick a plot somewhere and figure out, okay, what am I going to study? Cooper Island provided a flat place where birds were breeding in nest sites that were readily accessible, and I had known enough about seabirds at that point. I said, well, this could be an interesting colony to study because you can study it. You can't study it. You can't study most seabird colonies. So I went back in 1975, and this is to thank BLM and NOAA as part of the Outer Continental Shelf Program for getting this part really started, and took pieces of random wood, propped them up as a piece of plywood propped up by a piece of driftwood here, and basically built nest sites, because guillemots are so easy in terms of where they breed. You can basically create a dark cavity, and they will move in. They're also very good at being handled. You can handle them, put bands on them, put data loggers on them, and they don't freak out. So seabirds as indicators of the ocean system is something that happened during my time as a seabird biologist. We used to be concerned about age at first breeding, various things that you ask if you're interested in seabirds. And then it became obvious, okay, seabirds are reacting to the marine environment, and this is probably the thing that justifies my presence at this conference, is that some of the things that are being sold downstairs and some of the things that you're thinking about buying, seabirds do those things. They go out and they can tell you what's there if you monitor them, if you look at their chick growth rates. So if you look at their egg size, and we look at basically everything we can at the colony to be able to pick up seasonal and annual variation in the marine environment, which is what we're most concerned with now. Mainly because there are 6 people in the world who really care about black guillemots. 3 of them don't like me very much. But the people who care about the world's oceans, as you well know, is basically everyone cares about the world's oceans, and I take I don't try to talk people into being a guillemot lover. I say no, it is the canary in the coal mine, even though I don't like that analogy. So when I first started thinking about studying seabirds, I thought I'd go to a Scottish colony like this and study black guillemots. It's a very nice colony there. My colony looks like that. It looks like a parking lot where someone left too much stuff and a bunch of things that look like pigeons hanging out. But I'm able to get very good data as a result. So I built, I put up nest sites. Funding from NOAA OCSEP ended in '81. I went back on my own in '82 and have been going back every year since, essentially on my own. And I built these nest sites, and the guillemots liked it a lot. I built the largest black guillemot colony in the state of Alaska and in this section of the Western Arctic just by turning over these boxes. And again, I did that not because it's better to have more guillemots in the world, but it's better to have a large sample size, as you all know. And the original 10 birds that I found out there weren't going to do it for me, or the 10 pairs. What I didn't know is that the period prior to my study didn't have much global warming. And the period during my study has had a great deal of warming. And the fact that I had found a species that is ice adapted meant a great deal. And this is just a chart of how much the state of Alaska has warmed over that time period. But Barrow, Alaska is a very interesting place because it straddles 0 Celsius, 32 Fahrenheit, much of the summer. It'll freeze any day of the summer, and it'll be above freezing any day of the summer. But so that if you get warming there, just a few degrees can push that window much higher, much more than if it was a place where you had something that was well below 0 or well above 0 and had a 2 or 3 degree change. And the change in Barrow has been extreme. There has been a 3.5, this was recently updated, it was 3.5 degrees Celsius change, and the world is concerned about a 2C world. Barrow is experiencing a 3.5C world, and it is a place where snow and ice can melt rather rapidly, and species that have parts of their life history either constrained by or facilitated by snow and ice habitats are going to be among the first to be able to see the impacts of climate change. I found this on the web at one point, did a cut and paste. I can't find it again. I can't ascribe it to anyone. If you want to say it's me, that's fine. I guess that's that. But Barrow has had this warming. And again, I didn't know when I started in '75 that it would warm that much. I had no idea that was going to happen. People say, gee, George, how did you know? Of course I didn't know. Yeah, I actually did the study for 30 years thinking it would warm. And that warming is important to guillemots because they need a snow-free cavity to lay their eggs and raise their young. The period when the ground is snow-free in Barrow is rather short. Things melt out in early June. They freeze up, or snow starts being built up later in the year. So the black guillemot breeding season is a rather long one. It takes the female 14 days to make an egg after she has access to a dark cavity, so snow has to melt to do that. The eggs are incubated for 31 days, and then they have a rather long period in the nest, as all seabirds do, because they have to go out and exploit the marine environment, which is patchy, unpredictable, and various things like that. They go from 35 grams to 350 grams in 5 weeks. So they have an 80-day nesting period. That has to be facilitated by the cavity. They have to have that much space. And it turned out that prior to my finding the birds being on Cooper, many of the years didn't have that. So I might have found that colony just when the early traces of global warming were opening up that snow-free window enough to make things happen. And we did find in 19. Well, actually, so no, I'm sorry. I'm going to have to get to this. We have found that birds are now breeding earlier as the snow melts earlier. Things have gotten crazy. In 2016, they laid eggs much earlier. And there is a paper online where this and all the other physical changes that are being seen at Barrow will be coming out soon in this bulletin of the American Meteorological Society. But because this is an ocean meeting, I should get to this. Arctic cod are the lemming of the offshore seas. If you know the tundra, the lemming drives everything in terms of snowy owls, Jaegers, fox all prey on it. It's a very simple Arctic system with very few trophic levels and very little diversity. Arctic cod are basically the only forage fish in the Arctic basin. Guillemots breeding on Cooper Island have a limited foraging range of around probably 10 to 15 kilometers. And one of the reasons they do is because they have to feed their young one fish an hour approximately. So they can't fly out very far. So they have to have a lot of Arctic cod around. And they breed on an island that is surrounded by ice when they get there. The ice breaks up during the breeding season, and then at the end of the breeding season, the ice has disappeared. So, and this ice disappearance happens at a time when they're doing the most important thing they have to do all year, which is raise their young. And both a parent's caloric needs are highest, certainly the chicks are highest, and being able to raise young during that period is going to tell you what happens with the colony or not. The ice concentration north of Barrow was good for guillemots for a long period of time. It started getting a little bit wonky in the late 90s, and recently there has been no ice north of Barrow. And again, I had no idea that I would be, when I certainly started the study, that I'd be seeing something in the 21st century that basically the primary prey of the species that I was studying would be taken away. birds have now gone to feeding on sculpin, a nearshore fish that is pretty close in terms of calories, we now know, to what Arctic cod provide, but they have that large bony head that a chick gets it in the stomach and can't digest it quickly. So it's actually an issue with flow through, that basically they can only eat one maybe every 3 hours rather than maybe the one every hour for Arctic cod. So they have had trouble as the parent birds have switched to sculpin because of the four-horned sculpin having these four horns and that sort of head. We have chicks. I saw this 4 weeks ago. We had chicks in the nest that had tried to swallow sculpin and choked on them. They were losing weight. They were eating whatever they could. And this change is due to the fact that it's a sea surface temperature north of Cooper Island, and the ice conditions have gone from being Arctic to subarctic. Arctic cod don't do well above, they don't do that well above 2 Celsius. They really don't like it above 4 Celsius. It's now regularly above 4 Celsius north of Cooper, and as a result, Guillemots aren't finding what they want. There were 3 years. We had one retro year, 2006, where the ice was close on the 1st of August, a year in the middle, 2007, where the ice was kind of close, and then in 2011, the ice was gone. And this is a critical time when the chicks are really starting to gain weight, and some hatching is going on. And we made observations of the fish being brought in every day, the percent of cod, percent of anything else that was being brought in. In 2006, when there was lots of ice, it was basically it was very close to 100% Arctic cod. That was dominant throughout. We saw in 2007 what we now see almost every year. Cod are there at the start, but then as the ice retreats, the waters get warmer. You now have sculpin coming in, and then in 2011, we didn't see a cod after the 6th of August. We had major die-offs. There are 2 chicks in the nest. Most of the beta chicks, most of the younger siblings died. And again, this was written up in a Progress in Oceanography paper that I recently published. So what this means to a parent guillemot is that they went from being able to feed a chick, turning around and seeing this situation, which looks like a smorgasbord to them probably in terms of what they could feed on, to a world that looks like this. And this again, in terms of what I've experienced, all the data I've gathered, I used to walk down the beach, and I certainly went back for the first decade or so because I loved this sort of scenery, seeing this ice offshore. This is what it looks like offshore now, and it says more to me than any of the graphs of what's going on. People will say, isn't that just one colony that you're looking at? And again, there has been a general ice retreat throughout the Arctic Basin, and places where there are black guillemot colonies, some of them of 50,000 pairs or so, were close to the ice in 1981, and now have the ice far offshore, so it's probably happening there. It's just that there wasn't anyone who wanted to spend the last 44 years of their life studying them. As the ice has retreated, that has been an opportunity and a downside to other species. Horned puffins are a common species in the subarctic. There are 1 million of them roughly, at least there were at one point, in the Bering Sea. They bred up into the central Chukchi up until 1986, when they came up to Cooper Island and started breeding. So I had a subarctic species coming in, coming up to Cooper Island to breed. It was very exciting. Except at the fact that they're a nest competitor. They would go into the nest, push out eggs, they would kill chicks with their very charismatic bills, and cause all sorts of problems. This, by the way, is a puffin egg, a puffin nest on the right-hand side, and a guillemot nest or guillemot eggs on the other. They actually are sharing this for a short period of time. The puffins pushed the eggs out shortly after this photo was taken. The other range shift has occurred because something that lives on top of the sea ice has come onto Cooper Island because the ice retreat has been so major. This is one of the scariest pictures I was more scared at this point. Gary Brosh took this photo. The only gun on the island is in the tent. I had no idea how polar bears were going to act. This was in August 2002. I now know, I've had the short and long course on polar bear interactions over the past 15 years now, and I wasn't in any major danger. But again, it did more to make me think about climate change than all of the graphs, because it was a midbrain response in terms of the fact that, okay, you may not live through climate change. So now polar bears are a common sight on the island. they show up typically in late July and August, and then they're basically stranded there until the ice reforms in the fall. They come up to my cabin, as this one did in 2008. I was sleeping at this point. I heard a scratching noise. This was a camera we had for a Guillemot nest site, and I happened to go check, and I said, oh, what's going on? And oh, yeah, that's what the scratching noise was this morning. We have put up an electric fence since then. And the bears stay outside of it. This one is unfortunately eating vegetation because that's all it can really eat on the island because there's nothing really to eat except Guillemot chicks. And that is the downside of the easy nest access I had for all those years, is that I can flip a nest site over, polar bears can flip a nest site over. So in 2009, due to these two range shifts in the puffin and the polar bear, out of the 184 chicks that hatched, there was actually a race to see who was going to kill more, the puffin or the polar bear. Only one chick fledged that year because of this. I wanted to keep the study going, and I was packing pelican cases, and I thought, you know, if I drill a hole in the edge, in the end of this, and Guillemots are so generalized in terms of where they'll breed, I bet you I can get Guillemots to breed in this. So I put out 10 of them in 2010. And this was the big test. A polar bear showed up, and I thought, okay, can it open? I didn't know if they could figure out the latch, if they'd bite it or something. And it turns out pelican cases, and why pelican, I sent this to Pelican, they didn't want to use it in their marketing or anything else, but pelican cases can stand up to the world's largest terrestrial predator. They did say they'd give me like 5 for free or so, which wasn't quite enough. Nanook, a Canadian firm, and I can highly recommend them as a great case making. They have much nicer latches and everything else. Nanook happens to be the Inuit name for polar bear. It's just by chance. And I said, this is kind of ironic, but I want you to donate 200 cases because I want to recreate all those wooden sites. So they said, well, we can give them to you at cost, which turns out to be $22 versus the $100 that they sell them for on Amazon. So I took out 200 nest cases, and if you fly over there now, it looks like a Samsonite luggage truck has exploded. Because there are it isn't this pristine Arctic thing, but also at this point, these guys became the canary in the coal mine. Because if I had just let things go, you know, there would still just be 10 pairs there. If I had let things go in 2010, it would have been reduced to probably nothing because polar bears would be eating the chicks. I wanted them to monitor the oceans, and that really was the thing I did. I mean, past that point, all of the demographics changed a little bit because I was doing so much to keep them there. Now polar bears just walk by the cases. They have no real interest. I mean, they will go up to one case, like you saw, and maybe play with a little bit, but then there's no reinforcement, and they'll even get bored after that. Other things that have happened up there that have impacted the Guillemots are the fact that ocean warming is causing increases in wind. In 2000, we had a major storm that had major impacts on the people of Barrow and also on the Cooper Island colony, in that 1/3 of all the chicks died during a windstorm that parents clearly weren't being able to feed in that. The island used to have a permafrost core. I buried my yogurt and other perishables next to this permafrost in a kind of an ice cellar situation. I went back a few years ago, started digging my ice cellar. There is no ice under Cooper anymore, and the island is eroding. That means that some of the nest sites that were used for a very long period of time are no longer being used, and of course, coastal erosion is a major issue there. So essentially, what has also happened to the population is that it has dropped from the almost 200 pairs in 1989 down to this past year. I didn't have time to put it on this graph yet, to 85 pairs, which it was in the 80s, and that is almost certainly due to the fact that the sea ice extent, and this is the blue line is the September sea ice extent, has been going down over that period of time, and a species that depends on sea ice during the breeding season and in the winter has been monitoring those impacts. So what I saw over the past 44 years is that there was a warming trend which actually occurred prior to my getting up there that first let Guillemots breed there because it opened up the snow-free window on the ground. And then there was a short period, there was the Guillemot salad days, when you had a big enough snow-free window and the ice was just offshore. You could show up late, maybe, and even lay an egg in late June and still be able to raise young. But then, and then you had earlier breeding as snowmelt became earlier. But then there were shifts in the SST and in the ice conditions starting in the 21st century that caused a prey shift, that caused a decrease in in productivity, and had this nest competitor in the horned puffin and a predator in the polar bear show up and also decrease things to the point where we had to do that. And there have been continuing population declines in the 21st century. Now, this is the projected, this is the modeled sea ice of when it actually might disappear. It is strange to me. I know that it's strange to do a 44-year study. It's stranger to me still, because I don't think that's strange because I did it. It was my life. But it is stranger to have the ice disappear the way that it did, and knowing that if I were to keep the study going for a similar period of time, I would actually be able to see the ice-free Arctic. Let me just say that we have a Cooper 2025 campaign to try to keep the study going until 2025, because we will then have a 50-year database that we definitely much want to keep going. I wanted to show you some recent data. This is just from a few days ago, just how warm it is where the Guillemots are now. This is the temperature anomaly, and you can see in the area just north of Alaska just how warm it is. Birds tell stories. People who gather I'm more taken with the physical data than the biological data in terms of climate change, because the physical data is so great. But I was on the cover of the New York Times Magazine in 2002 because of the fact that the New York Times thought this is a good climate change story, and there was a 13,000-word article which you can read. We have a link to it from our website. That led to me being on the David Letterman show, the first ornithologist ever. David Letterman has a climate change, program as such that he wanted me to come on and talk about that. IBM ThinkPad gave me a ThinkPad and said, could you use it for a month and tell us where you do your best thinking? And I said, I'll do it if I can say on ice that may not be here in 100 years. And they ran this in 2002 in a lot of newspapers and various things like that. There was a play in Greenland, or rather a play called Greenland, that the Royal National Theatre in London put out that had a thread on Cooper Island and had quotes from me that were in the article, and had someone dressed up like me, Michael Gould, he's an actor I'm good friends with now, who actually had to have stage Guillemot poop put on his parka so that he looked like me in the field. And he had a so this was, we have stayed well below the funding radar because we get by totally on donors now, but we've been able to be up in the media radar at a level that I never expected. We got this on the CNN website last year. And again, whenever no one wants to talk about the snow melt, they don't show snow melting because snow melting is like watching paint dry. They show the Guillemots that are reacting to that snow melt. So, okay, having said all that, I just want to make the other point is that Guillemots aren't important. They are important to me, but Guillemots and this pace of change is important in terms of what it shows in terms of the pace of change. Certainly in the Arctic, the people who live in the Arctic are having to deal with this, but soon it's going to be everyone in the world, and as we speak, it's everyone in the world who's having to deal with climate change. So I have no illusions about the fact that, oh, by the way, a 44-year or 43-year Guillemot study is that critical, but we all know what's causing the ice to melt. We know it's fossil fuel emissions, and dealing with that, and you can see the correlation with the cumulative CO2 emissions and ice extent. As long as we're going to be burning fossil fuels, we're going to be melting sea ice. So the take-home message is that the Western Arctic went from being too cold to too warm in a short period of time. In 1972, any hippie walking down the beach could flip over a piece of wood and have Guillemots breed there. Now Guillemots are breeding in bunkers. And that's the only way that they're breeding there. We have a website, cooperisland.org. We are on Facebook and Twitter if you want to find us there. If you want to get in touch with me for any reason, we are looking for partners for our Cooper 2025 campaign. Any way in which you might facilitate even our outreach, if you have a way in which we can get the story out. If there's someone from the Seattle area who'd like to be on our board, we would very much like to do that because we really do want to hit 2025. And when we do, it will probably make a lot of noise. I'd like to thank again the organizers of this conference and the various people who have let me do this study and the residents of Barrow, Alaska. I am 20 miles away from the largest Inuit community in the world, and it is their support and friendship and everything else that has let this happen. If Cooper Island were anywhere else in the world, I wouldn't have been able to do it. So, thanks very much. Thanks very much.
That was indeed fascinating. And I want to thank both of our speakers for lending us their time and their expertise and sharing their views with us. And I'd like now to turn the balance of the program back to Donna. Thank you all very much.